In this lecture, we are going to begin our section on mythology. First, we'll start with an introduction to mythology, then we'll explore Edith Hamilton's article, and then finally we will conclude with the sections we have read from the Iliad. Before we get into the Iliad, we will also go into more of an in-depth analysis of some of the main characters to make sure you understand who is who. But to begin with, let's start with mythology. So what is mythology? The term comes from the Greek word mythos, which simply meant authoritative speech, story, or plot. Myth is a traditional story with collective importance, and this collective importance refers to the collective importance the story or the myth holds for a society. Myths usually began as a oral tradition that was handed down from one generation to another. In fact, the word traditional comes from the Latin word trado, which means to hand over. So in the traditional idea, the story is one that has been handed over from one storyteller to another without the invention of writing. Myths also hold meaning for the group and not just an individual. Myths are also anonymous. We do not know who originally created them, and they have no identified authors. Now, there are different types of myths. There are divine myths, legend, and folk tales. First, divine myths. Divine myths are stories where supernatural beings are the main characters. Usually in divine myths, that explains why the world is the way it is. And again, these feature supernatural characters that are superior to human beings in power and in splendor. These could take the shape of human form or some other animalistic form. They usually have the power to control awesome forces of nature, and their own forms can be enormous and of stunning beauty or ugliness. Sometimes, though, they are little more than personified abstractions without clearly defined personalities. For example, here, the sculpture you see is the winged victory of Samarith. And what it is, winged victory, or the Greek Nike, is the goddess of victory. And think of that idea. Victory is an abstraction. We know what it is, but it doesn't have a tangible form. That is an example of a character within a divine myth. Another example could be, though, is something fully developed with a fully developed personality, such as like Zeus, who is the ruler of the gods. Divine myths, the setting, is usually the events take place in a world before our own or outside the present order, where time and space often have different meanings from those familiar to human beings. Gods are often both actors in the stories and objects of venerations in a religious cult. There's a double function that leads to divine myth being confused with religion. Remember, myths are traditional stories. Religion is a belief in the course of action that follows from that belief. And again, divine myth explained why the world is the way it is. Next, we have legends. Legends are analogous to history, meaning it can be compared to human history, and usually it's done so to make things clearer or easier to understand. Legends attempt to answer the question, what happened in human past? Now, our characters in legends, the central characters are human beings, but they are not ordinary people. They are heroes and heroines. Usually they are members of the aristocratic elite, and they usually have some extraordinary physical or personal qualities, such as they're stronger, more beautiful, or more courageous than ordinary people. The setting of legends is also different. Legends take place in our own world, although they take place in a time in the distant past. Usually legends contain an element of historical truth. And then some legends also serve a specific etiological function, meaning they talk about how the world came into an existence. Probably one of the most famous legends, and one you are probably familiar with, is that of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Sadly, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot, how we know it in the legend, is not something that actually existed. This story begins with a young Arthur in The Sword and the Stone. Remember that he was squiring for a knight, the sword broke, and he had to find a replacement sword, and there was a sword sticking in a stone, and he went and pulled it out of the stone. Well, the legend is that he who pulls the sword from the stone is the true king. Again, this and the other elements that continued are not historical fact, right? There really wasn't a King Arthur that pulled a sword from a stone. Merlin, the dragons, all of that adds to the legend, yet there are certain elements of it that we believe could have possibly existed. But in actuality, they did not. And then finally, we have folktale. Folktale is a very broad category, and because of this, it's more difficult to define. Folktales include a variety of traditional stories that are usually grouped together. Easy way to think of this, it's any traditional story that is not a divine myth or a legend. For example, many of your Grimm's fairy tales, Aesop's fables. The central characters in your folktales are human beings, and they are ordinary men, women, and children. A folk tale tells about ordinary folks. A fable is only one category of these tales, and it has a certain meaning, a moralistic message to it. An example of this would be Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare. We all know the moral is slow and steady wins the race. Now, with folk tales, no one believes these are true and that they are there for a specific purpose, either a moralistic message or for entertainment. The main characters are often being persecuted or victimized in some way. Think about being bullied by siblings. Cinderella is an example of this. And then often the ending brings about a reversal of fortune, meaning this is our happy ending. Our character who was either persecuted or victimized now comes out victorious. They often have a trickster character. This is a character who is very smart and uses their wit to outsmart their opponent. The primary function of most folktales, again, is to entertain, but it can play an important role in teaching and justifying customary patterns of behavior. And then in folk tales, we tend to have different types. There are actually more than 700 different types in traditional folk tales around the globe. And an example of this is what we would call the Cinderella type. Here you have a constellation of motifs that constitute an independent story that can stand on its own. But we have some common characteristics. For example, the young woman, the younger sister, who is abused by either a stepmother, evil stepsisters. There is a spirited helper. Eventually there is marriage to a prince, and she leaves home at a young age to live happily ever after. However, this is considered a type because they are always distinctive and unusual in some way. Think of all the adaptations you know of the Cinderella tale, from the classic Disney stories to ones that have even the Disney live action, to Cinderella stories that have been remade into other genres. Think of how different they are, yet they all have those commonalities. Another popular form of the folktale is the quest. In the quest, what happens is we have a hero who seeks a special object. Usually they have to journey to a strange land and they face a powerful antagonist. The hero usually needs the assistance of others who are most likely magical in some way. The adversary somehow captures the hero, but the hero escapes, beats, or destroys the enemy, often through trickery. The hero takes the sought object, returns home, and is rewarded. Think of Disney's Aladdin for an example of this. And here is also an example of the hero seen as a clever trickster, whereas the adversary is usually brutish, stupid, or cruel. Another example of this would be in Homer's The Odyssey. The Odyssey tells a tale of Odysseus' quest to return home after the Trojan War. And Odysseus is a normal man, but he must face many challenges to get home to Penelope, his wife, after 10 years of the Trojan War. In general, we may describe much of Greek myth as mythology strongly coded by folktale. The main characters seem like they could be real people, but remember, most of these are gods. and the adventures are a sort more like a folk tale. And then finally, remember when you're reviewing, trying to figure out what you're looking at, if it's divine myth, legend, or folktale, the best way to start is to start by looking at who the characters are, the main characters, and where the setting is. Usually that can let you know what type of mythology we're looking at. Next, we're going to turn our attention to one of the readings I assigned for this week. And this is a small selection from Edith Hamilton's book, Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Hero. This was written in 1942, however, most of her writing is still relevant today. Here she explores the idea that Greek and Roman mythology is quite generally supposed to show us the way human race thought and felt for untold ages. Little distinction is usually made between the real and the unreal, and not everything is beautiful in mythology. She notes that there is usually some sort of horror lurking. But something she points out in this article is that with Greek mythology, this does not give us an example into what early Greek life was like. Because for this to have survived, most of it had been written down by Homer, is an example of this. Homer is the author of the Iliad, which we'll be reading in the next week or so. And what she says these myths actually show us is that we're seeing the beliefs of an already civilized class. Again, for them to have a written language, we have a high society. So they do not throw any clear light upon what early mankind was like, but they do throw an abundance of light upon what early Greek life was like. So what does this mean? Earlier societies, nomads and such, there is no record of them through the myths. The versions that we know, the ones that have survived, have been cleaned up, polished, and are developed versions. Also, she talks about the Greek miracle. During this time, mankind is becoming the center of the universe. The Greeks did have the pagan system of the gods. However, Hamilton claims, by the time the myths began to be written down, there wasn't such a fear. And in fact, she says the miracle of Greek mythology was a humanized world, men freed from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown. Meaning men at this time did not fear the gods in the ways that they are often projected in the stories. That they know these simply are stories in mythology. The gods being made human made them seem much more familiar and maybe even less of a terrifying factor. It was also a way that you could know and understand the gods. You still had some fear of them, but you could also laugh at them and try to understand them. You weren't afraid that they were going to strike you down at any moment. In fact, even the most nonsensical myths take place in a world which is essentially rational and matter of fact. Some examples: Hercules has a home in Thebes, which is a true city. People can actually go and visit the spot where Aphrodite was born of foam in Kythera. And then Pegasus, the very famous winged horse, was said to have a stable in Corinth. A familiar location or habitation gave reality to all of the mythical beings, according to Hamilton. The world of the Greeks was not a place of terror for the human spirit. They were not afraid of the dead. They usually saw them as the piteous dead, that they were to be pitied for not existing. We have no evil witches to be feared, and there's no astrology. And then Hamilton claims the early Greek mythologists transformed a world full of fear into a world full of beauty. And again, that's part of the Greek miracle, that we have a humanized world with men free from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown. Now, there were dark spots. For example, the gods often acted in a way that no man would, meaning very cruelly and contemptibly. An example, in the Iliad, which you'll see, Hector is more noble than many of the gods. Hector is the prince of Troy and a great warrior. We also do have beast-like gods. We have the satyrs, which are goat men, centaurs, which are half horse, half man. And there are some references to human sacrifice, but they're pretty rare. Monsters do exist, but they're usually there to be defeated by the hero. Some example are the Gorgons, which were the females with hair made from snakes that when you looked at them, they would turn you into stone. Medusa is an example of this. The Hydras, which were water creatures with many heads. And then chimeras, which were a fire-breathing monster made up of many creatures. Usually they're pictured as a lion, a goat, and a snake all together. Now, Hamilton states Greek mythology is not to be read like a kind of Bible, that Greek mythology is an explanation of something in nature, how any and everything came into existence, and how all that is, how it all happened. And she claims that at this point, it wasn't truly a religion. Myths, she says, are early science, the result of men's first trying to explain what they saw around them. And then not all of these, but some are even just for pure entertainment. Now, that is not to say there is no religion in these at all. There is some allusion to religion. And especially Hamilton talks about the changing role of Zeus. Zeus goes from a vengeful god to one that punishes those who do wrong, like lie and break oath. Justice becomes Zeus's companion, and he becomes the protector of the helpless. And she claims this shows a reflection of what human beings needed in a god they worshipped. And Hamilton claims that this idea of this transformed Zeus of old eventually became the universal father that was adopted by many monotheistic religions. Now, the last section of this reading, she talks about the Greek and Roman writers of mythology. While this is interesting, I will not quiz you on the dates and the titles and the plots of the specific writers, but I do want you to be aware of some of them, such as Ovid, who was a Roman poet. Homer is going to become very important because he was a Greek poet and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad which we will be spending time on in the next couple of weeks. So please do look over some of this, but again, I won't quiz you on the specific names, dates, or the plays, such as Sophocles wrote, he was a Greek tragic poet who wrote Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone. Finally, in this section, I have attached a YouTube video here, which I would like you to take a look at. Now we're going to begin to shift our attention over to the Iliad. What we'll talk about first is we're going to do a general introduction. We'll talk a little bit about Homer and then the beginnings of the Trojan War. Homer, you can see I have listed here 2 different sets of dates. Why? Because we're really not sure exactly when he lived. He is a Greek poet, but most of his life is a mystery. He's often credited with the enduring epic tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but as far as his personal life, we don't have a lot of facts. Some scholars believe Homer was one man. However, others think these iconic stories were created by a group of different individuals, and once they were finally written down, the character Homer was given credit for them. Next, we're going to talk about the Trojan War, because when we talk about the Iliad is taking place in the last year of the Trojan War. The Trojan War was a 10-year battle between the Greeks, or the Achaeans, and the Trojans, who lived in the city of Troy, also known as the city of Ilion or Ilium. What happened was the Greeks traveled to Troy to seek revenge for the abduction of Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy is the face that launched 1,000 ships. However, she was originally Helen of Sparta. She was wife to the king there, King Menelaus, and Paris stole her and took her back to Troy. The Greeks, or the Achaeans, gathered their forces and traveled to Troy, which is in modern-day Turkey, to seek revenge and to get Helen back. And so how did it come about that Paris, who is also a prince of Troy, his father is King Priam, his mother is Hecuba. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, is his older brother. So how is it that Paris stole Helen? Well, that's what's known as the Judgment of Paris. And what happens is Zeus was actually holding a banquet in celebration of the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, who were actually the parents of Achilles. However, Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited. She wasn't invited to the celebration because was believed that she would make it unpleasant for everyone. Well, of course, she finds out she's not invited and she's angered by this. So, what does she do? She makes it uncomfortable for everyone. She actually shows up at the celebration, and with her, she brings a golden apple. And etched upon this golden apple, it says, "For the fairest one." And then she just tosses it into the crowd. Well, three different goddesses claimed the apple was theirs. These were Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Hera, remember, is Zeus's wife. Aphrodite is the goddess of love and beauty. And Athena is the goddess of wisdom. So they asked Zeus to judge which of them is fairest. And he basically said, I'm not getting involved in this because you have his wife and Athena is definitely his daughter, and then many origin tales have Aphrodite also being his daughter. And he's basically like, I'm not getting in the middle of this, no. And what he decides is that they will actually have a mortal decide this. And he declares that Paris would be this mortal. Again, Paris is from Troy. The reason why he thought Paris would show good judgment is because Paris had a bull, and it was bested by another bull. Well, the bull was Ares, when he had taken on the form of a bull and won. But Paris still said, you know what? He still gets the prize. He bested my bull. Because of this, Zeus was like, well, he's a fair and honest individual, so we'll let him judge. So now it comes that Paris is to decide between Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, who is the fairest. Well, this takes place on Mount Ida, and they all each actually try to bribe him. Hera offered to make him the king of Europe and Asia. Athena offers him wisdom and skill in war. And Aphrodite, again, goddess of love, offers the world's most beautiful woman, who was Helen of Troy. Well, who does Paris pick? He picks Aphrodite because he wants the most beautiful woman, who is actually Helen of Sparta at this time. Again, she's married to the Greek king Menelaus. So when Paris accepts Aphrodite's gifts, award the apple to her, he takes Helen away from Menelaus and takes her back to his homeland of Troy. Now, this not only makes the Greeks or the Achaeans very angry, of course it's also made Hera and Athena very angry because they weren't chosen. And in the painting here, you can see this taking place. We have Paris sitting down, and he's handing Aphrodite, with her son Cupid beside her, he's handing her the apple. We see Athena with her spear and her helmet, and Hera pointing to the sky and pointing to the sky and the earth, basically saying, here, I'll give you a kingdom over this. We also can tell that's Hera because she has her signature headdress on, and she is shown with a peacock, which is usually one of her symbols. So that's the story of how the Trojan War began. That Paris, when he took Helen of Sparta back to Troy, the Greeks seeking revenge followed in their ships. Here you can see on the map, Troy is located in modern Turkey, and the different city-states that we're going to see represented in the Iliad, Athens, Mysia, Sparta, you can see them on the map of modern Greece. Now, for centuries, scholars had asked whether there really was a Trojan War. And what happened is the idea was it had been a legend. But in the late 19th century, an archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann declared he had discovered the remnants of Troy. The ruins that he uncovered sit a few dozen miles off the Aegean coast in northwest Turkey, a site that indeed fits the geographical description of Homer's Troy. And then one layer of the site, roughly corresponding to the point in history where the fall of Troy would have taken place, shows evidence of a massive fire and destruction that would have been consistent with the city getting sacked. Now, most scholars accept Schliemann's discovery city as a site of the now ancient Troy. However, many remain skeptical as to whether Homer's Trojan War actually took place or not. Now, what's interesting though is with this discovery, there's also no proof that it did not happen, and many scholars now admit the possibility that some truth may lie at the center of the Iliad, hidden beneath many layers of poetic embellishment. So now on to the Iliad itself. The Iliad was written about 760 to 710 BCE. It's also called the Song of Ilion or the Song of Ilium, which are another name for the city of Troy. It's an epic poem in didactic hexameter, meaning it's 6 feet. A foot is 6 feet per line, and a foot is one stressed and one unstressed syllable. But the didactic makes it one long and then two short syllables. Now, when you're reading yours, you're going to be like, well, ours isn't written this way. Remember, you have a translation. The Iliad is among the oldest existent works of Western literature, and it's often paired with the Odyssey, which is seen as a sequel. The Odyssey is also attributed to Homer, and again, this is Odysseus' journey home from the war. Along with the Odyssey, in its written version, is usually dated to around the 8th century BCE. Recent statistical modeling based on the language evolution gives a date of 760 to 710 BCE. It was written in the Homeric Greek, which is an amalgam of Ionic Greek and other dialects. The Iliad is set during the Trojan War. The Trojan War was actually a 10-year-long siege of the city of Troy by a coalition of the Greek states, and again it tells the battle and events during the weeks of a quarrel between King Agamemnon, who was the general or the leader of all of the combined Greek armies, and the great warrior Achilles, who was the greatest of the Greek warriors. Now, although the story only covers a few weeks in the final year of the war, the Iliad actually mentions or alludes to many of the Greek legends about the siege. We know events that happened earlier, including how the war began, and even though the Iliad concludes with the war still waging, we know how it's going to end. In fact, the most famous object or artifact from the Trojan War, the Trojan horse, is actually not even in the Iliad. The tale ends before Odysseus' plan comes to fruition. Again, Achilles is still alive at the end of the Iliad, but we know his fate is not to survive. All right, now this will begin the second part of our lecture, and what we're going to spend some time on here is we're going to look at some of the main characters within the text. There are many characters within this work, and I suggest that you make yourself either a chart or a list so that you can get these characters straight. Again, it's sometimes hard to remember them because Homer will call them by different names at times. So let's first start with the Greeks, or the Achaeans, as they're known within the text. And you need to remember that we refer to them as the Achaeans, meaning this general term for the Greeks. But the Greek army is actually made up of various different kingdoms, such as Sparta, Athens, the Myrmidons. And so that's why you're going to have different kings and leaders within the Achaean army itself. So let's start with probably the most important of all the characters in the book, Achilles. And actually, the Iliad is a text that's more about the rage of Achilles than any other figure. Achilles is the son of the military man Peleus. Homer will sometimes refer to him as the son of Peleus. And his mother is the sea nymph Thetis. Achilles is the most powerful warrior in the Iliad, and he commands the Myrmidons, which are soldiers from his homeland in Phthia, which is in Greece. Achilles is very proud and headstrong, and he takes offense easily, and he often reacts with blistering indignation, especially when he perceives his honor has been slighted. And the beginning of the text starts with his argument with Agamemnon. Achilles' wrath at Agamemnon for taking away his war prize actually forms the main subject of the Iliad. There is Achilles' mother Thetis tried to make him immortal by dipping him into the river Styx. However, he was left vulnerable at the part of his body where she had to hold on to him, his heels. So that's actually the only part where he can be killed. And eventually, not in the Iliad, but that is how he dies. He takes an arrow in the heel and he perishes. Now, there's a prophecy about Achilles. He knows that if he lives the life of a warrior, he is destined to live a short life. Yet, if he gives up the life of a warrior, he will live a longer life. And this becomes very important later on in the text. Next, I shouldn't have switched sides. Next, we'll look at Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae, and he is actually the leader of the entire Achaean army. His brother is King Menelaus of Sparta, Helen's husband. Agamemnon is often arrogant and selfish. He provides strong leaderships, but he can often be reckless and self-serving. Like Achilles, he lacks consideration and forethought, and he often lets his emotions sway him. There are many times throughout the Iliad that he actually wants to give up and just go home, but his troops won't allow him. And his tactless appropriation of Achilles' war prize, the maiden Briseis, creates the crisis for the Achaeans when Achilles, insulted, withdraws from the war. Agamemnon's fate, he actually survives the Trojan War, but when he returns home after being gone for 10 years, his wife, Clytemnestra, is not happy to see him. She's been ruling with her lover in the 10 years that he's been gone, and she's actually still mad at Agamemnon because before Agamemnon left for the war, the gods had told him he needed to make a sacrifice. And the sacrifice was actually his daughter Iphigenia. And he did it. He sacrificed her to the gods. And then when he comes home, he also actually brings Cassandra with him as his concubine. This does not make Clytemnestra happy, and Clytemnestra and her lover actually do end up murdering Agamemnon. And this is told in Aeschylus' series of plays, the Oresteia and Agamemnon. The next Achaean that we're going to look at is Patroclus. Patroclus is Achilles' beloved friend, companion, and advisor. They actually grew up alongside each other. Patroclus is a great warrior in Pitha, and he's also been under the guardianship of Peleus, Achilles' father. He's devoted to both Achilles and the Achaean army, and Patroclus stands up against the enraged Achilles. At one point in the story, Patroclus begs Achilles to rejoin the fighting because the Greeks seem to be losing. And when Achilles still refuses, Patroclus begs him to let him show up wearing Achilles' armor, so at least the Greeks and the Trojans both think that he has rejoined. Achilles agrees to this and lets Patroclus wear his armor, yet he tells him, don't follow the Trojans back. If they flee in defeat, do not go past the ships. And we will see later on this is going to have a devastating effect. Patroclus is, sadly, during the Iliad, he is killed by the Trojan warrior Hector. Next, we're looking at Odysseus. Odysseus is a fine warrior, and he's probably the cleverest of all the Achillean commanders. He's usually called wily Odysseus, and he's likened to a fox. Along with Nestor, he is one of the best public speakers of the Achaean army, and he often helps mediate between Agamemnon and Achilles during their quarrel, and he often prevents them from making rash decisions. In the companion piece to the Iliad, the Odyssey, this is another work by Homer, and it actually tells the tale of Odysseus' 10-year journey home to get to his wife Penelope. So he was gone for 10 years in the war, and then it took him 10 more years to get back home. Happily enough, Odysseus' ending is happy, and he is reunited finally with his wife. And then next we have Menelaus. He is the king of Sparta. He's the younger brother of Agamemnon, and it's his wife Helen that was actually kidnapped by Paris, the Trojan prince. However, unlike Agamemnon, Menelaus is usually quieter. He's less imposing and he's less arrogant than Agamemnon. He's not the best of the Achaean warriors, yet throughout the Iliad, there are often times where he takes on a role and accepts challenges from other stronger warriors. Other warriors that are important, Diomedes, he's the youngest of the Achaean commanders, and he is bold and sometimes proves very impetuous. After Achilles withdraws from combat, Athena actually inspires Diomedes with such courage that he wounds two gods, both Aphrodite and Ares, in his fighting. We have Ajax, who is an Achaean commander, sometimes called Great Ajax. He is the second mightiest warrior in the Achaean army after Achilles. He is very large, and his extraordinary size and strength help him wound Hector twice by hitting him with boulders. And then we have Nestor. Nestor is very important. He is the king of Pylos, and he is the oldest of the Achaean commanders. Although age has taken much of his physical strength away, it's left him with great wisdom, and he often acts as an advisor to the military commanders, especially Agamemnon. Nestor and Odysseus again are they're the best public speakers, and Nestor's speeches tend to be long-winded, but he often encourages both Achilles and Agamemnon to rationally look at situations. And then lastly, the Myrmidons, you'll hear those mentioned. Those are the soldiers who are under Achilles' command, and they hail from Achilles' homeland in Pitha. So those are some of the major Greeks. Now let's look at the Trojans, or the llium. Remember, Ilion is another name for Troy. First and most importantly, we have Hector. Hector is the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, the rulers of Troy. He is Paris's older brother, and he is the mightiest warrior in the Trojan army. He mirrors Achilles in some of his flaws, but his bloodlust is not as great as that of Achilles. Hector is devoted to his wife, Andronomy, and their son, Astyanax. But he resents his brother Paris for bringing war upon their family and city. He is fighting to protect his city and his family. And his death is one of the major events of the tale, and he is actually killed by Achilles. Next, we have King Priam. He is the king of Troy, husband of Hecuba. Priam is actually the father of 50 Trojan warriors, not all by Hecuba, but this includes Hector and Paris. Though he is too old to fight, he has earned the respect of both the Trojans and the Achaeans by his virtue and his level-headed, wise, benevolent rule. He treats Helen kindly, though he laments the war that her beauty has sparked. Next, we have Hecuba, who is the queen of Troy, wife of Priam, mother of Hector and Paris. And we'll see her role a couple times throughout the work where she's pleading for her son's welfare. And she knows, again, the fate of the city, and she knows that most of her sons probably will not survive the conflict. Then we get to Paris. Paris, also referred to at times by Alexandros. He is the son of Priam and Hecuba, younger brother of Hector. And it was Paris's abduction of the beautiful Helen, the wife of Menelaus, that sparked the Trojan War. Paris is often self-centered and unmanly. He fights effectively with a bow and arrow, but never with the more manly sword or spear. He often lacks a spirit for battle and prefers to sit in his room making love to Helen while the others fight for him, thus earning both Hector's and Helen's scorn. At the end of the Trojan War, it's actually Paris's arrow that finds Achilles' heel and leads to his demise. More of the Trojans, we have Helen, reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the ancient world. She was stolen from her husband Menelaus and taken to Troy by Paris. Interestingly enough, she's the sister to Clytemnestra, who was Agamemnon's wife. She now loathes herself and is miserable because this war has caused the death of so many Trojan and Achaean men. Although her contempt extends to Paris as well, she continues to stay with him. After the Iliad, Paris is actually eventually killed, and most accounts have Helen returning to Greece with Menelaus. Aeneas is another important Trojan. He is a Trojan nobleman, and he's the son of Aphrodite and a mighty warrior. In fact, the image you see here is a Bernini sculpture of him as he's fleeing the fallen city of Troy, carrying his father, and his young son is following him. The Romans believe that actually Aeneas later founded their city. He's the protagonist in Virgil's masterpiece, the Aeneid, which tells the story of him fleeing the burning city of Troy with his son and carrying his father. In the tale, what eventually happens is Aeneas is leading a group of those who escaped the fall of Troy, and there's a prophecy that says they will know they're at their new homeland when they're so hungry they eat their plates. Well, there's different adventures, and what eventually happens is they're in Italy, and the custom is there's a thicker bread, excuse me, that your food is served on. So you eat the food off of it, and then by the time you're done, the bread's softer and you eat the bread. So they do this, and then they realize they just fulfilled the prophecy, that they were so hungry they ate their plates. So they know they're in the area in which they are supposed to stay. That area is now Rome. And so Rome traces back their greatness to the Greeks of that time through this tale. Next, we have Andronomy. We've already mentioned her. That's Hector's loving wife. She often begs Hector to withdraw from the war and save himself before the Achaeans can kill him, because she knows what their fate is going to be, that if Troy falls, she'll either be killed or made to be a concubine to some Greek, and she's sure that their young son will be murdered. And then Astyanax, that is their young son, Hector and Andronomy's infant son. Sadly, after the fall of Trojan War, most accounts do not show Astyanax surviving, that he is actually thrown from the walls of the city of Troy because the Greeks feared he would grow up to be a great warrior like his father and seek revenge. And then these three characters are very important to Book 1. First, we have Chryses. Chryses. This is a priest of Apollo, and he is in a Trojan allied town. What happens is the Greeks go there and sack that, and his daughter, Chryseis, is whom Agamemnon takes as a war prize. Because of this, Chryses is a priest of Apollo, and he asks Apollo in help getting his daughter back. So Agamemnon took Chryseis. Briseis is actually another war prize that is Achilles. She is Achilles' war prize, and when Agamemnon is forced to return Chryseis to her father, he takes Briseis from Achilles, thus sparking the feud between them. So those are some of the major mortal characters. Now we're going to look at the gods, because it's important to remember which side of the battle the gods are on, because they often interfere within the work. The first is we have Zeus, who is the king of the gods, husband of Hera. Zeus claims neutrality in the conflict, but he often tries to make the other gods stay out of from participating in it. However, he usually throws his weight behind the Trojans. Why? Because, number one, we'll see in Book 1, Theseus asks him to help the Trojans, and we already know the fate of the Trojan War. The gods know the fate. Troy is destined to fall. However, Zeus at times helps him so that fall does not occur before he wants it to. Next, we have Hera, and she is for the Greeks. She hates the Trojans. Why? Paris did not pick her in the judgment of Paris. He chose Aphrodite. So she hates all the Trojans. And she does not want just Troy defeated. She wants the city destroyed. She wants it burnt to the ground. She is Zeus's wife, and she is often conniving and headstrong, and we will see many times when she goes behind Zeus's back on matters in which they disagree. And she works together with Athena to crush the Trojans, who again she passionately hates. The next we have is Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, and she also is for the Greeks. Why? Like Hera, she was not chosen by Paris, and so she passionately hates the Trojans, and she often gives the Achaeans valuable aids. In fact, she's the one who, when Achilles withdraws from the battle, she goes to Diomedes and puts in him this fighting spirit and helps him slaughter lots of Trojans. And then when Achilles rejoins, she helps him in battle. Next, we have Thetis, who she is also for the Greeks. Remember, she is Achilles' mother. She is a sea nymph, and she is very devoted to Achilles. Now, she knows the fate of his, and she would rather he not join the war or rejoin the war, because she knows if he rejoins, then he is destined to live a short life, and there is nothing she can do about it. When Achilles finally does rejoin the battle, she commissions Hephaestus, the god of the underworld, to design a new suit of armor for him. Next, we have Apollo. Apollo is for the Trojans. Apollo is the son of Zeus and twin brother of the goddess Artemis. Apollo is the god of sun and the arts, particularly music. And he supports the Trojans and often interferes in the war on their behalf, especially supporting Hector and Aeneas. Next, we have Aphrodite. She is obviously for the Trojans. She's the goddess of love and the daughter of Zeus. She's married to Hephaestus, but maintains a romantic relationship with Ares. She supports the Trojans because she supports Paris, because Paris did choose her as the fairest one. Although she supports the Trojans, she's pretty ineffectual in battle, and she is actually one of the gods that is injured by Diomedes. Next is Poseidon. Poseidon is for the Poseidon is for the Greeks. Poseidon's the brother of Zeus, and he's the god of the sea. The reason why he is for the Greeks is because he actually has a long-standing grudge against the Trojan citizens, because he helped them build the city of Troy, and then they were supposed to offer him sacrifices, and they never actually did this. Therefore, he supports the Achaeans in the war. Next, we have Hephaestus, who is for the Achaeans, for the Greeks. He is the god of fire and husband of Aphrodite. Hephaestus is the god's metalsmith and is known as the lame or the crippled god. Although the text doesn't make this clear, his sympathies in the mortal struggle, he tends to be seen as being more on the side of the Greeks because he does create the new set of armor for Achilles. Next, we have Artemis, twin sister of Apollo. She's for the Trojans. She's the goddess of the hunt and daughter of Zeus. Ares is also for the Trojans. He's the god of war and lover of Aphrodite, and Ares generally supports the Trojans because of Aphrodite. And then finally we have Hermes, who is for the Greek. He is the messenger god, and Hermes actually is one who, at the end of the text, escorts Priam to Achilles' tent to regain the body of Hector. So that's an overview of who's who within the war. There's actually another slide here. This is kind of interesting. This shows you where many of the main characters were from. Troy is on the right in modern-day Turkey. Greece is on the left. And you can see where the wide variety of places the individuals were from. After their name, if there is a cross, that means they were killed in the Trojan War. Any of them with the green outline are the Greeks. In the yellow and the yellow outline are the Trojans. So, we only read books 1 and 2 for this section. So let's talk about book 1. The opening line gives us an overview of what's going on. This is all about the rage of Achilles. In fact, if we look at the opening text here, sorry, I didn't have my book open. It states, "Anger be now your song, immortal one. Achilles' anger doomed and ruinous that caused the Achaeans loss on bitter loss, and crowded brave souls into the undergloom, leaving so many dead men, carrion for dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was done. Begin it when the two men first contending broke with one another." So this tells us the beginning of it, that the Trojan War is going on. And this all is talking about the rage of Achilles, and that it started when the two men first broke with one another. This is the moment where Achilles and Agamemnon fight. So, what's happening as the poem begins? Chryses, the priest for Apollo, is trying to get his daughter back from Agamemnon. Agamemnon tells him no, and he threatened to kill him if he lingers there any longer. So, what does Chryses do? He prays to Apollo for help. Apollo helps. He actually rains down fire and plague upon the Achaeans for 9 days, killing many of them. Achilles finally approaches Agamemnon and asks him, does he know why Apollo is so mad at them? Well, what happens is another seer comes forward and says he knows, but he's too afraid to say it because he fears his answer will anger Agamemnon, and Agamemnon may kill him for this. He asks Achilles for protection, and Achilles agrees to protect him. He says, no harm will come to you when you tell us why this is happening. So the seer tells him it's actually Agamemnon's actions toward Chryses, Apollo's priest, that angered him. So, what happens? The seer says the Greeks must appease Apollo, and to do this, they have to return Chryseis to her father with no ransom and then offer a hecatomb to Apollo. Hecatomb is a specific sacrifice. How does Agamemnon react to this? On page 15, he rails against the priest but says he will give her up because it's for the best. But if he'll give her up, a prize must be given to him because he deserves his own portion of the spoils of sacking the city. Well, Achilles' response to him says, well, what are they supposed to give him? All the goods, the spoils have already been divided, and then that would make somebody else have to give up their spoil. And that it's better just for him to give up Chryseis for the good of everybody else. But Agamemnon will not relent. And basically he says, fine. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your prize away from you. And Achilles' response to this is on page 16 and 17. Achilles frowned and looked at him, then said, you thick-skinned, shameless, greedy fool. Can any Achaean care for you or obey you after this on marches or in battle? As for myself, when I came here to fight, I had no quarrel with Troy or Trojan spearmen. They never stole my cattle or my horses, never in the black farmland of Pitha ravaged my crops. How many miles there are of shadowy mountains, foaming seas between? No, we joined for you, you insolent boar, to please you, fighting for your brother's sake and yours to get revenge upon the Trojans. You overlook this dog face or don't care, and now in the end you threaten to take my girl, a prize I sweated for and soldiers gave me. Never have I plundered like your own from any Trojan stronghold battered down by the Achaeans. I have seen more action hand to hand in these assaults than you have, but when the time for sharing comes, the greater share is always yours. Worn out with battle, I carry off some trifle to my ships. Well, this time I make sail for home. Better to take now to my ships. Why linger creating cheated of winnings to make wealth for you? So he berates Agamemnon. He says, I'm always the one at the front lines. I'm always the one doing the battle, yet you're the one who's always sure to take prizes. And now you're going to take my prize away from me? When I came here, I had no quarrel with the Trojans. That Achilles and his army came just to help Agamemnon and Menelaus. And basically saying, you're taking this from me. You're now going to betray me. What does Agamemnon say? He tells him, fine, go ahead, leave, go home, but he's still taking Briseis from him to show others what happened when you cross him. Achilles actually contemplates killing Agamemnon, but Athena interferes. Hera sends her, tells her, don't kill Agamemnon, that in the end he will have 3 times as much reward. Achilles honors the god's demand, but he again verbally attacks Agamemnon on page 19. He calls him a coward, and he talks about how he hides in the middle of the army where it's safer. And then he makes an oath that one day every Achaean soldier will groan to have Achilles back, meaning he tells them he's going to refuse to fight anymore. Who eventually stops this argument? Nestor does. Nestor steps in, and he admonishes them both by saying the Trojans would love to see how they are fighting amongst themselves, and he tells them to take his advice. He tells Agamemnon not to take Achilles' girl, and he tells Achilles not to defy his leader. But they don't take his advice. Achilles leaves, goes back to his ship with Patroclus. Agamemnon returns Chryseis and makes the sacrifice to Apollo, and then sends others to Achilles' tent to get Briseis. Do they want this task? No, they're worried about what Achilles will do. Remember, Achilles is the most fearsome of the Greek warriors. But we see something about Achilles' character in this moment. He tells them not to be afraid, that he has no anger toward them, and that he knows they are just the messengers. They take the girl then and then leave. Achilles then weeps with anger, and he prays to his mother Thetis. And she comes before him, and he tells her what's happened. And then he asks her to go to Zeus and tells him to take the side of the Trojans in the war to defeat the Greeks. And he does this because he wants the Greeks to suffer in a way that he has. And this is a moment that's a little bit troubling, because remember, Achilles is one of the Greeks. He says, remind him of these things, cling to his knees and tell him of your good pleasure. If he will take the Trojan side and roll the Achaeans back to the water's edge, back on the ships with slaughter. All the troops may savor what their king has won for them, and he may know his madness, what he lost when he dishonored me, peerless among Achaeans. And so what Achilles wants is he wants the Greeks to suffer under Agamemnon's rule so they can see how important Achilles actually is for this battle. Thetis says she will do this. Next we look, Agamemnon sends Chryseis back to her father. However, he does not take her himself. He actually sends Odysseus. Her father, Chryseis, accepts this and asks Apollo to stop the attack on the Greeks. They then all make the sacrifice and celebrate in Apollo's name. Odysseus and the men return to the Greek camp with a wind from Apollo. So now we go back to Achilles. Battle is raging on, and he misses the battle. Zeus returns to Olympus, and Thetis goes to him and asks him to make Agamemnon pay for what he's done to Achilles. Zeus's response to this is, first, he's annoyed that she's trying to guilt him into doing it. And he says if he does this, if he takes the side of the Trojans, it will drive him into open war with Hera. But he says he'll think on it and that he will eventually help her. Well, who sees this encounter? Hera does. And what does she do? She confronts him about it. And Zeus tells her that she doesn't need to know everything, and then he threatens her with bodily harm. They get into an argument. Well, Hephaestus, Zeus and Hera's son, sees this, and he actually intervenes. And he said, it's a sad day when two of the greatest gods are fighting over mere mortals. He tells Hera to make up with Zeus and calm his anger. And at the end of the book, Hera does this. So peace is made between the gods, they eat, and then they all go to their homes and to bed. Zeus lays in his bed with Hera next to him. Then I had you read Book 2. In Book 2, it begins with Zeus trying to figure out how to keep his word to Thetis, of having the Greeks suffer losses, but also to keep Achilles safe. So what happens is he actually sends a dream to Agamemnon, saying the gods have all agreed and that the Achaeans, the Greeks, should win the war, and he urges him to attack Troy. So what happens, Agamemnon wakes up, he gathers all of his generals, and he tells them of this dream. But he wants to test the soldiers. So he tells all the soldiers they're actually leaving and going home. They all start packing up, thinking, finally, after 9 years, we're going home. Well, who stops this? Hera and Athena. They don't want the Greeks to leave. Remember, they want Troy to be destroyed. So what happens is they go to Odysseus. Odysseus suspects it's a test. Athena kind of hints to him about this. And he begins to urge the men to stay, saying, would you give up so easily? Do you really want to return home after all this time and admit that you fled? And only one of the soldiers disagrees. This is Theseus, and he rails against Agamemnon. On page 42, you can see how he is described. It says, so all subsided except one man who still rallied on alone, Theseus, a babbling soldier who had an imprudent way with officers. thinking himself amusing to the troops, the most obnoxious rogue who went to Troy. Bow-legged, with one limping leg and shoulders rounded above his chest, he had a skull quite conical and mangy fuzz like mold. Odious to Achilles this man was, and to Odysseus, having yapped at both, but this time he berated Agamemnon, at whom in fact the troops were furious, lifting his voice and jeering. And so he raises some of the same concerns that Achilles did, that Agamemnon's always the one to take the most prizes, yet he's not one who does much of the fighting. Odysseus eventually shames and humiliates him, and Odysseus reminds the Greeks that they are prophesied to win the war. And this is on pages 45 to 47. He says, look, we've waged war for 9 years. The prophecy says we are going to win it in the 10th year. Now that the 10th year is here, will we actually just desert because Agamemnon says to go home? And he claims that those who are brave and honorable will not leave, but will stay to see the fighting and the battle to the end. And because of this, the soldiers pass Agamemnon's test. Agamemnon praises Odysseus and claims Troy will fall that day. Agamemnon is still lamenting over his feud with Achilles, but he tells the men to get ready for a fierce battle, and they make a sacrifice to the gods. Nestor urges them to make haste, and he calls the men to arms. They do so, and as the men gather, Athena walks among them and strengthens them. She gives them courage. On page 50, lines 529 to 531, for at her passage war itself became lovelier than return, lovelier than sailing in the decked ships to their own native land. Homer then claims there are too many to name, so he only names the captains. This continues on from pages 51 to 60. He's talking about everyone gathering and coming to arms. And so we have this kind of great scene of the Greek troops getting ready. But who does not march or gather? Achilles. And if you see the bottom of page 57, he talks about this. Right? The Myrmidons and Helions and Achaeans, led by Achilles and their 50 ships, but these made no advances now to battle, since he was not on hand to dress their lines. No, the great runner, Prince Achilles, lay amid the ships in desolate rage for Briseis, his girl with her soft tresses, the prize he captured, fighting all the way, after he stormed that town and stormed the walls of Thebes, overthrowing the spearmen Menelaus and Eusophanes, son of Europhanes and Seleucides. For her his heart burned, lying there, but soon the hour would come when which he would rouse. And so we see in this moment, with this great battle coming on, that Achilles is not joining the war, but Homer's foreshadowing. We know Achilles is eventually going to rejoin. Well, what happens? The Greeks are marching, and there's beautiful poetry of Homer. It says they devoured the plain as though it was a prairie fire. So they're marching to Troy. Well, Iris goes and warns the men of Troy. Hector calls the men to battle, and they all form on Briar Hill, which is outside the gates of Troy. Hector leads the Trojans. Homer then goes through the Trojan ranks. So why do you think he spent so much time on the specific troops and the specific captains? He was probably doing this so you could understand and see this great, great battle and understand how large this war actually was. Now, these are the only 2 books I had you read, but I'll give you a brief summary of what goes on. The fighting goes back and forth between the Trojans and the Achaeans. What finally happens is Achilles still will not rejoin the war. There's different efforts to get him to rejoin. Patroclus goes to him and says, look, the Trojans have the upper hand. If you will not return to the battle, at least let me wear your armor so that the Greeks and the Trojans alike will think you have rejoined. It'll inspire the Greeks and it'll put fear in the Trojans. Achilles allows him to do this. And he warns them, though. He says, do not, when the Trojans retreat, do not follow them past the ships. Do not go to the gates of Troy. Well, Patroclus, dressed as Achilles, rejoins the battle, and he is just slaying Trojan after Trojan after Trojan. and the Trojans do retreat. Patroclus can't believe this. He thinks it's a chance they have to actually end the war, and he follows the Trojans back to Troy. What ends up happening? Hector and Patroclus face each other, and in battle, Hector kills Patroclus. Because of this is that moment where Achilles is so upset and enraged over Patroclus' death, he sees it as his own fault that he returns to battle. And when he does finally return to battle, it's with more rage, and he kills Trojan after Trojan. In fact, he keeps throwing their dead bodies into the river, and there are so many dead bodies in the river, it actually stops the flow of the river. Eventually, he and Hector face each other. And this is a poignant moment because Achilles knows by rejoining the battle, he is fating himself to a short life. Well, Hector also knows what his fate is. He knows that he is probably going to die in battle and that Troy will fall, his wife will probably become some concubine, and his son will either be a slave or will be murdered. And so what happens is we do have Achilles and Hector who face each other. Hector is actually wearing Achilles' armor because after he killed Patroclus, he took the armor off of him. Remember, Patroclus was wearing Achilles' armor. So when they face each other, Achilles knows the weakness of the armor and he is able to kill Hector in the weak spot. He actually spears him in the throat. And on his death, Hector asks Achilles to return his body to his father so he can properly be buried and that his soul can rest. Achilles, still in his anger, tells him that no, he is not going to do this. And in fact, after he's done, after he's killed Hector, he actually ties Hector's body to his chariot and he drags it around the gates of Troy. Eventually, what happens because of this, we go back to the Trojan camp. Achilles still has Hector's body, and they prepare and have a funeral for Patroclus. Finally, after days of Achilles basically desecrating Hector's body, Apollo steps in and says, look, how can you let this atrocity continue with Hector? Hector found favor with all the gods. So Zeus steps in and says, all right, Thetis, go to Achilles, tell him to give Hector's body up for ransom. And then he sends Iris to go to King Priam and says, go by yourself with just an old man driving your wagon, bring ransom for Achilles, and ask for Hector's body back. And so the book actually, the tale ends with Hector and Achilles with Priam and Achilles together. And Achilles accepts Priam into the camp, and he is actually the one who gets Hector's body ready for burial. He actually even picks up the body and puts it into the cart so Priam can take him home. And so we have almost peace between the two. Achilles asks Priam how many days they need to mourn and have Hector's funeral, and he asks him for 11. And Achilles tells him, fine, that he'll make sure that battle does not rage for those 11 days. And he tells them that the Trojans need not fear the Greeks in those days. They can do whatever they want to prepare for the funeral. And so this is actually how the text ends, that the Trojans leave the city to get the wood for Hector's funeral pyre. On the 10th day, they light it, they put his remains in an urn, and then bury the urn and return to Troy for a banquet in his honor. And that's how the text ends. The last line actually says, so they performed the funeral rites of Hector, tamer of horses. So the Iliad is all about Achilles' rage, and that's actually where the Iliad ends. Achilles' rage has been subsided. He has gotten over his feud with Agamemnon because he wants to avenge the death of Patroclus. And he does this when he kills Hector. And it's when he gives Hector's body back that he himself is actually able to come to some sort of peace. He's able to eat and sleep again. So, how does the Trojan War actually end? Well, this is the accounting from Virgil's book, the Aeneid. This is in book 2. After many years had slipped by, the leaders of the Greeks, opposed by the fates and damaged by the war, built a horse of mountainous size, through Pallas's divine art, and weave planks of fur over its ribs. They pretend it's a votive offering, meaning a peace offering. This rumor spreads. They secretly hide a picked body of men chosen by lot there in the dark body, filling the belly and huge cavernous insides with armed warriors. Then Laocoon rushes down eagerly from the heights of the citadel to confront them all, a large crowd with him, and shouts from far off, "O unhappy citizens, what madness! Do you think the enemy sailed away, or do you think any Greek's gift free of treachery? Is that Ulysses' reputation?" Ulysses is the Roman name for Odysseus. Either there are Greeks in hiding, concealed by the wood, or it's been built as a machine to use against our walls, or spy on our homes, or fall the city from above, or it hides some other trick. Trojans, don't trust this horse. Whatever it is, I'm afraid of Greeks, even those bearing gifts. And this is what happens. There are the Trojans inside, or the Greeks inside. When the Trojans bring it into the walls and they're celebrating, at night the Greeks sneak out. They let the rest of the Greek army in, and Troy is sacked. King Priam is killed when Troy falls. Andronomy, Hector's wife, is taken as a concubine by one of the Greeks. Eventually, we know that Achilles is killed by Paris's arrow, and then Paris is actually killed by Philoctetes. Laocoon was mentioned within this, and Laocoon was a Trojan who tried to warn the rest of the Trojans not to accept this gift. And he had been warned by Poseidon, the god of the sea, remember, who was angry at the Trojans, not to warn them. But he goes against this. And you can see his punishment here is in this sculpture. So what happens is Poseidon sends these great sea serpents not just to kill Laocoon, who you see in the middle here, but also his two young sons. So that's the end of the Iliad. Again, we just read a small section, but I want you to pay attention to the writing, the role of the gods, the role the gods play within the works themselves, and then the text itself. It's not so much about the Trojan War, but again, about the rage of one man. This is all about the rage of Achilles. And what I want you to think about and discuss in your discussion board, was Achilles justified in his rage? Why or why not? And then what are also your impressions of Agamemnon? And then from what you've learned of the end of the tale, what's your ending impression of Achilles? Does he ever go and make amends for this rage, for leaving the war? Or do you think he was even justified in the first place? Next time we will pick up our discussion. We're going to talk about mythology and art. And then the rest of the slides in this series, it's just giving you a little bit more of information and background on the Greek gods and goddesses.